getting near the end. Okay, we've got two different things we need to do with spinner elements. The first is just the bracket. Instead of rendering it from a specific point of view, we have to treat this a lot more like you would actually a gaming element for a video game, which is to bake the texture so that no matter what perspective you're looking at this from, you have kind of correct mapping. If we just did a perspective map of this, you would, as soon as you moved like this, whatever you had rendered here would be like on the inner walls. It doesn't look any good, and brackets in particular just have so much overlapping geometry that you got to bake those out. Then the other thing we're going to do is take the other parts of the spinner. They're going to be combined into a single mesh, and we're going to bake that as well. But we're not going to bake a lot of baked-in lighting for this, because it spins and it looks really goofy if you have like a shadow here, and as it's spinning upside down you can still see the shadow. It looks ridiculous. So we're just going to bake some ambient occlusion, which is just like some slight shadows where things are close to each other that we can bring into Visual Pinball, and then we kind of let the rest of that get tweaked with materials in VP. So those are the two things we're going to do. So first thing we do is take this, make a duplicate for safety, and throw it in junk. Then we're going to take this and we're going to solo it. How about it if we really solo it? There we go. You're welcome. And all of these modifiers, our mirror, our solidify, those need to be a permanent part of this thing. So then what we want to do is start pulling this apart in a UV map. So we want to grab, where we can, we want to grab loops. Ick. Not like that though. I'm going to turn off X-ray so that we can just get things on the surface. So there's a loop all the way across the edge. And instead of doing it with faces, I'm going to do it with edges like that. And then we're going to mark those edges as a seam, so that when we do our UV map, we're going to get a cut along there. Okay. Same deal. Mark seam. The way that these are unwrapped is less important than if you were trying to texture these from an image in a gaming engine, because then you would try to make sure all the edges are straight, and it's still probably, you know, good practice, but we don't need to worry about that a whole lot, since essentially everything that's going to go on this texture is still being baked out. It's not being projected by or it's not being textured by anything in Visual Pinball. Okay, so we have those seams, and then put a seam here. And a seam here. Okay. And then we can unwrap, and you can see all the pieces unwrap over here. So here's the top, here's the bottom, here are those sides that we did, and here are the flat parts here. So, you know, that's not terrible. Maybe we could do better by doing a smart UV project or unwrap. You know, that's not bad. And we could adjust how we pack these, leave a little bit of space in between everything. Something like that. There's a whole art to doing this, and it's not my expertise by any stretch of the imagination. Okay. Okay, so that's mapped well. We're going to duplicate this and going to export one copy, and we'll just call it bracket. And then that copy can get moved to some place where it isn't going to be rendered. So we'll move that to junk later, or we'll just not make sure it doesn't get rendered. Then this copy, we actually want to render the bevel and the subdivision in our bakery. And baking, I don't know, I'll have to check. In this version of Blender, I don't believe it actually applies these when it renders unless they've actually been applied. So we're going to go ahead and just hope this doesn't make a mess of our UV mesh, and it doesn't. So we're going to get the nice shape by baking this, but use the simple geometry that we saved and exported for our actual mesh. So yeah. So to set up baking then, I'm going to take that duplicate copy we made and I'm going to move it to junk. This is the copy that has the applied modifiers, so more geometry than we maybe want to bring in to visual pinball. Here's our texture. It's just called metal, and what we want to do is just create a new texture for this. We'll call it bracket. And in our nodes, we want to have that image right here so that it has something to render to. So we're going to call it bracket. And just sit there and be highlighted. And then when we go to our renderer, we're going to bake. And baking is extremely noisy and very slow, and Blender's great deficiency right now is that it doesn't have any kind of smart denoising for baking objects. So that's too bad. Our GI is on. We're going to end up rendering out two different states, GI on and off. The disadvantage of doing this is you don't get reflections, like directional from where the camera is, but you do still pick up like ambient light on it, so it's still going to have some texturing and shape. It's just not going to have that really nice reflected kind of ray traced look that we got from our other things. That's why we don't do a lot of this, besides the other things I listed, time consuming and no denoiser. Try not to do a lot of this if I don't have to. Okay, so we bake. Okay, so there we go. That's our texture all baked. So we're just going to go to our image manager, bring those in. And then make sure to add the texture change to the script as well. And we can take a look. Fingers crossed, but I'm pretty optimistic about this one. Oh yeah, that looks really nice. Even got the directional light from the HDRI, the environment light on it. And you can see the GI light hitting the side, and that'll work from all angles. So yeah, definitely worth baking. That looks really good. The next thing to do then would be to grab all of these elements that are attached to the spinner. So those will all become one mesh eventually, but for the sake of making this not impossible, let's not do that part yet. So we'll solo our spinner. I was kind of halfway through that project earlier and then had to walk away, so I don't remember where I ended up, but here's what I did. Is I had made a UV map of another copy of this spinner. So with the spinner, just like I did with the bracket, I baked it. And in fact, I baked all of the pieces that need to move together because Visual Pinball only accepts a single texture per mesh, and we wanted those all to be part of the same mesh. So here's what I did, is instead of the way we did the full texturing on the bracket, on the spinner, I just did the ambient occlusion, which is just kind of shadows around where things are close to each other. This may be the best way to explain it. So here's a dead bumper cap that has some kind of ornate sides on it, and this is an ambient occlusion map, except for the part where I wrote art here, because you can apply your art there. But this is the shading from things being close to each other, and then if you look at the spinner, same thing. Here's our spinner. There's the front and back of our spinner. There's the insides, and then you can see this is where the wire goes inside, and this is where that weight goes on the bottom. And here's the weight and the wire and those little plastic washers. So none of this is textured in that it doesn't have color, doesn't have a material, but it has the shadow values of where those pieces were touching, and it's pretty independent of like there's just a tiny contribution from the environment light, like the HDRI, or the playfield lights, or like the GI, which I turned off on purpose because we weren't trying to capture that here. So that's what you're seeing here. And then, all I had to do then is add the art onto it, and we had our spinner. And the nice thing is about having this ambient occlusion map is that then, oh, look, here's a spinner for Meteor, and all I did was add the art right there and a big chunk of orange on, I used multiply as like the blend mode so that we can keep the shadows and apply the color. So that's, so I don't have to bake a new texture for the spinner every time I do a new game. It's done. I can bring that into Meteor whenever I want. And I think really, without hyperbole, this spinner will end up being my favorite part of the game. I'm going to do this sideways real quick just so you can see the detail a little better. But as far as detail and how this turns out, this just looks so cool. Let's boot up. There we go. Here's a ball. And I don't know like how much you can see in YouTube, but the detail in here, to see the weight inside, the two layers of the spinner, the wire inside of it, just looks incredibly realistic to me. And that's thanks to the ambient occlusion map. If you just put the mesh in here and let VP do its thing, you could turn the ambient occlusion settings on then, which is fine, but you take a performance hit, and we already have the shading baked into all of our textures already, so we really don't want to turn that on if we don't have to. But I think that looks just really, really nice. So anyway, I'm really excited about that.